You're 6 years old, and this morning your uncle is ascending to the throne. The new Basilius of the Byzantine Empire. Everyone is in a celebratory mood. You're excited too because they made you a new outfit, purple silk, a prince's garment. But your mother is acting strange. This morning she hugs you tightly, crying. Why are you crying, mother? You ask. Today is a celebration. She just shakes her head, says nothing. In the afternoon, guards come. Is the young prince ready? They say. The emperor summons him. You're taken to the great hall of the palace. Your uncle sits on the throne. Beside him are priests and generals. Everyone is looking at you. Strange looks. Pity? Something you should fear? Come closer, nephew, says your uncle. Soft voice, but cold. The guards are holding you. Why are they holding you? Were you going to try to run? Then a man approaches carrying something. Metallic, shining. A knife? This will hurt, says your uncle, and I'm sorry for it. But you must understand, a flawed prince cannot claim the throne. This is simply a precaution. You don't understand what he means until the blade touches your nose. That sharp pain, blood, screaming, and then no nose, just an open wound. The nose that protruded forward is gone. Your uncle murmurs something. Now you're safe. No one will see you as a threat to the throne. You're 6 years old and you've just learned, in the Byzantine Empire, physical imperfection is political insurance. A noseless prince can never become emperor. Tonight I'll tell you about Byzantium's most ruthless political tradition, Rhinokopia, nose cutting, and the story of hundreds of princes and princesses mutilated so they could never claim the throne. Before diving into one of history's most systematically cruel political practices, if you enjoy learning about the darker truths of human civilization, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these difficult chapters together from different parts of the world, connected by our shared need to understand how power corrupts and how societies normalize cruelty. The Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, lasted for over 1,000 years, from approximately 330 CE, when Constantine established Constantinople as his capital, until 1453, when the city fell to Ottoman conquest. Throughout this millennium, Byzantium was one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations, preserving classical learning through the Dark Ages, developing complex bureaucracy and law, creating magnificent art and architecture, and maintaining military power that held back invasions from multiple directions. But this sophisticated civilization also developed a systematic approach to political violence that was both creative and horrifying. At the center of this system was a simple principle: a physically imperfect person could not rule. This wasn't just custom or preference. It was law. The emperor had to be whole, complete, without visible deformity or disability. This requirement, originally based on classical ideas about physical perfection reflecting spiritual and moral perfection, became a political tool of remarkable effectiveness. If you wanted to neutralize a political rival without actually killing them, which the church increasingly condemned, you could simply make them physically imperfect. Cut off their nose, blind them, sever their tongue, remove their ears. Any of these mutilations would legally disqualify them from ever claiming the throne or holding high office. This practice became so common that it has a name in Greek: Rhinokopia, literally nose cutting, though it's often grouped with other forms of mutilation under the broader term of political disfigurement. And the victims were often children, young princes and princesses who represented potential threats to whoever currently held power. Let's understand the political logic that made this practice seem not just acceptable but necessary to Byzantine rulers. The Byzantine succession system was theoretically based on imperial acclamation and divine sanction, but in practice, it was chaotic and dangerous. Unlike some monarchies that developed clear rules of primogeniture, the eldest son inherits, Byzantine succession was more fluid. Any male member of the imperial family might potentially claim the throne, and many did through military coup, palace conspiracy, or popular uprising. This created a situation where having male relatives was simultaneously necessary, you needed family allies, and dangerous. Those same relatives might try to take your throne. Every emperor faced a dilemma. His sons, brothers, nephews, and male cousins were both his support network and his greatest potential threat. Killing them was one option, and it was frequently used. Byzantine history is filled with imperial fratricides, sons killing fathers, uncles eliminating nephews. But this approach had problems. First, the Christian Church, increasingly powerful in Byzantine society, condemned murder. An emperor who too openly slaughtered his relatives risked ecclesiastical censure and losing popular support. Second, killing all potential rivals might leave you without heirs or allies when you needed them. Third, there was always the risk that your chosen victim had their own supporters who might retaliate. Mutilation solved all these problems elegantly. It removed the political threat permanently. You couldn't reverse a severed nose or blinded eyes. It technically wasn't murder, so it avoided direct church condemnation, though church attitudes toward mutilation were were complex and changed over time. It allowed the victim to live, which could be presented as mercy, and which meant you weren't eliminating potential family allies completely, just neutering their ambitions. And it created a visible, permanent mark that advertised the consequences of challenging imperial power. The practice was particularly cruel when applied to children because children had no agency in the political conflicts that led to their mutilation. A 6-year-old prince wasn't plotting rebellion or threatening anyone, but he represented potential future threat. He might grow up to lead an uprising, or more likely, other ambitious men might rally around him as a figurehead for their own power plays. By mutilating him while young, you eliminated these possibilities before they could develop. Let's examine some specific cases that illustrate how this system worked in practice. One of the earliest and most famous examples involves Emperor Justinian II, who reigned from 685 to 695 and then again from 705 to 711. In 695, Justinian was overthrown by a military coup led by Leontios. The new emperor had Justinian's nose cut off and his tongue slit, though not completely removed. Justinian was then exiled to Crimea, where everyone assumed he would live out his days as a mutilated ex-emperor, no longer a threat. But Justinian was extraordinarily determined. Despite his disfigurement, he managed to build alliances, raise an army, and retake Constantinople in 705. He wore a golden prosthetic nose, earning him the historical nickname Rhinokopia, or the slit-nosed. His decade-long second reign was marked by extensive revenge-taking against those who had mutilated and exiled him. When Justinian retook power, he faced the same problem his enemies had faced: what to do with the family members of his rivals. He chose mutilation. The sons of Emperor Tiberius III, who had ruled from 698 to 705, were young children. Justinian could have killed them, but instead he had their noses cut off. The youngest was only 4 years old. This decision reveals the twisted logic of Rhinokopia. Justinian himself knew intimately the suffering caused by nasal mutilation. He had lived for 10 years with a severed nose, experiencing the physical pain, social stigma, and psychological trauma. Yet when he regained power, he inflicted the same mutilation on young children. Why? Because from his perspective, it had worked. It was supposed to have neutralized him politically, and it would have, except for his extraordinary determination and luck. For most victims, Rhinokopia was effective permanent political death. Another illuminating case comes from the reign of Emperor Constantine v. 741 to 775. Constantine had several brothers who posed potential threats. Rather than kill them, he had them ordained as priests, which legally barred them from imperial office, and also had their noses slit as additional insurance. This double approach, combining legal disqualification with physical mutilation, shows how thorough the system could be. The practice affected women as well as men, though less frequently since women couldn't claim the throne directly. However, imperial princesses could be dangerous as potential mothers of claimants or as symbols around which conspiracies might form. In 780, Empress Irene, acting as regent for her young son, had several of her political opponents' daughters mutilated to prevent them from making advantageous marriages that might threaten her power. The actual procedure of Rhinokopia varied in its details, but certain elements remained consistent. The victim would be held down, usually by guards or strong servants. For children, this restraint was essential since they would naturally struggle and fight. For adults, the restraint might be accompanied by beating or torture to break resistance. The instrument was typically a sharp knife or blade. Some accounts mention specialized cutting instruments designed specifically for this purpose, suggesting how routinized the practice had become. The cut would sever the nose either partially or completely. Some mutilations removed only the tip of the nose, leaving the victim with a flattened profile. Others removed the entire external nose, leaving only the nasal openings, creating the most dramatic disfigurement. The wound would then be cauterized, usually with hot iron, to stop the bleeding and prevent immediate death from blood loss. This cauterization was itself extremely painful, adding a second wave of agony to the already traumatic nasal severing. The goal was mutilation, not murder, so medical attention, crude as it was by modern standards, would be provided to ensure the victim survived. The survival rate was probably fairly high for adults who received immediate cauterization and basic wound care. Infection was a risk, but the face has excellent blood supply, which aids healing. Children, being more fragile, might have had higher mortality rates, though we lack statistical data. The psychological impact was probably more devastating than the physical. Imagine being a child and having this done to you. The physical pain would be intense but temporary, healing over weeks or months. But the psychological trauma would last forever. Every time you looked in any reflective surface, you would see your mutilated face. Every interaction with other people would involve seeing their reaction: shock, pity, disgust, fear. You would be marked forever as someone someone who had been politically neutralized, a living warning to others about the consequences of threatening imperial power. Byzantine society's reaction to these mutilated individuals reveals much about the culture's values and cruelty. The victims were stigmatized and marginalized. They couldn't participate in normal social life. Marriage was virtually impossible. Noble families wouldn't unite their daughters with mutilated men. Military service was closed to them. How could soldiers respect a visibly mutilated commander? Even religious roles had limitations, though the church was sometimes more accepting than secular society. The mutilated victims lived in a strange liminal state. They were usually maintained at some level of comfort, given allowances or estates to support them, because they were still family members and because displaying complete cruelty might generate sympathy that could be politically dangerous. But they were essentially retired from public life, visible yet invisible, supported yet marginalized. Some victims internalized their status and lived quietly. Others, like Justinian II, refused to accept their fate and worked to overcome it. The chronicles record cases of blinded or mutilated princes attempting to reclaim power. Though these attempts usually ended in execution, the mercy of mutilation only extended once. The practice of Rhinokopia raises questions about the church's role and response. The Byzantine church was powerful and had significant influence over questions of morality and legitimacy. How did church authorities justify or condemn this practice? The response was complex and evolved over time. Early in Byzantine history, the church was relatively quiet about mutilation. It condemned murder clearly, but mutilation existed in a gray area. It wasn't killing, so it didn't violate the commandment against murder. Could even be presented as mercy, sparing life while removing threat. Some church fathers engaged in elaborate theological reasoning to distinguish between mutilation and murder. They argued that while murder destroyed both body and potential for salvation, mutilation only affected the body. The soul remained intact, and the victim could still achieve salvation through proper Christian living. This reasoning allowed churchmen to accept, if not actively endorse, imperial mutilations. However, as Byzantine Christianity developed more sophisticated ethical frameworks, particularly under the influence of monastic theology, criticism of mutilation increased. By the later Byzantine period, some church voices were explicitly condemning rhinokopia and other forms of political mutilation as cruel and unchristian. But the practice continued because it served imperial needs too effectively. Even emperors who were personally pious and who took church teachings seriously found themselves resorting to mutilation when political necessity seemed to demand it. The gap between Christian moral teachings and political reality remained unbridged throughout Byzantine history. Let's consider the broader social implications of normalizing mutilation as political tool. When a society accepts that cutting off children's noses is a reasonable response to potential future political threats, what does that say about that society's values? Byzantium was, in many ways, remarkably civilized, preserved and transmitted classical learning. It developed sophisticated legal codes, many of which showed concern for justice and protection of the innocent. It created magnificent art and literature. It maintained hospitals and charitable institutions. Yet this same civilization systematically mutilated children for political convenience. This contradiction is important to understand because it challenges our assumptions about what civilization means. We tend to think advanced civilizations are more humane, that cultural sophistication brings moral progress. Byzantium proves this isn't necessarily true. You can have spectacular art and literature alongside systematic cruelty. You can have brilliant philosophy and barbaric practice. Civilization and savagery aren't opposites. They're often partners. The victims of rhinokopia, especially child victims, deserve individual recognition rather than being treated as mere statistics in Byzantine political history. Each mutilated child was a person with thoughts, feelings, fears, and dreams. Each experienced not just the physical pain of the mutilation but the psychological devastation of being marked as permanently inferior, dangerous, disqualified from normal life. In one morning, all of that was taken away. The procedure probably lasted less than an hour. The physical healing took weeks, but the psychological wound never healed. Every social interaction was now marked by his disfigurement. Other children, cruel in their honesty, would stare or ask uncomfortable questions. Adults would show pity, which might be worse than open disgust. He would grow up knowing exactly why he was mutilated, because someone wanted his uncle's throne and he represented a potential future threat. The injustice must have been overwhelming. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't plotted or conspired. He was 6 years old. His only crime was being born into an imperial family during a moment of political instability, and for that he was permanently disfigured, socially marginalized, legally disqualified from the position he had been raised to potentially inherit. As Constantine grew older, he would have understood more about Byzantine politics and the reasoning behind his mutilation. Would that understanding have made it better or worse? Knowing that your suffering was calculated, rational, and effective from a political standpoint might be more disturbing than believing it was random cruelty. At least random cruelty suggests the possibility of different circumstances yielding different outcomes. Systematic, rational cruelty suggests it would have happened no matter what, that there was no escape, that your suffering was built into the structure of how power operates. Some mutilated princes found meaning in religious life. Unable to participate in secular politics or military affairs, they could channel their energy into theological study or monastic practice. The Byzantine Church, despite its complicated relationship with imperial violence, did offer some space for mutilated victims to find purpose and community. But this solution was itself problematic. Forcing someone into religious life because you've made them unfit for secular life isn't really giving them a choice. It's another form of control, constraining their options so that the path you want them to take seems like the only possible path. The practice of Rhinokopia declined in later Byzantine history, though it never completely disappeared until the empire fell. Several factors contributed to this decline. The church's moral opposition grew stronger and harder to ignore. The practice's effectiveness was undermined by cases like Justinian II, where mutilated rivals managed to return to power anyway, showing that the strategy wasn't foolproof. And perhaps most importantly, as the empire weakened and faced existential threats from external enemies, internal political conflicts became less about competing imperial family members and more about survival against foreign invasions. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 ended the Byzantine Empire, and with it the practice of Rhinokopia. The Ottomans had their own brutal methods of eliminating political rivals, the fratricide law that we discussed in our earlier content ideas, but they didn't use mutilation in the same systematic way. When we look at Rhinokopia from our modern perspective, it's easy to condemn it as barbaric and assume we've moved beyond such practices. But have we? We no longer cut off noses, but we have plenty of ways to permanently mark, stigmatize, and marginalize people who are perceived as threats or who simply belong to the wrong groups. The felony conviction that follows someone for life, making employment and housing difficult. The sex offender registry that marks people permanently, even for crimes committed as juveniles. The various forms of social and legal disability we impose on those we define as dangerous or undesirable. These aren't physical mutilations, but they serve similar functions. Permanent marking that excludes from full participation in society. I'm not saying these are morally equivalent to cutting off a child's nose, but the pattern is similar. Society identifying certain individuals as threats and creating permanent mechanisms to neutralize those threats, often with little regard for whether the individual actually posed danger or for the human cost of permanent marginalization. The Byzantine Empire justified Rhinokopia through a combination of political necessity, legal tradition, and theological rationalization. We justify our own systems of permanent marking and exclusion through appeals to public safety, justice, and social order. The specific justifications differ, but the underlying logic is similar. Society's need to control perceived threats justifies permanently damaging individual lives. Understanding Rhinokopia isn't just about learning a disturbing historical fact. It's about recognizing patterns that persist across time and culture. It's about seeing how sophisticated civilizations normalize cruelty. It's about acknowledging that the boundary between civilization and barbarism is thinner and more permeable than we like to believe. The children who had their noses cut off in Byzantine palaces are long dead. Their suffering is over. But the mechanisms that enabled that suffering, the political calculations that made child mutilation seem rational, the social structures that stigmatized the victims, the theological frameworks that provided moral cover, all of these persist in new forms. Every society has its Rhinokopia. Every culture finds ways to permanently mark and marginalize those it defines as threats or undesirables. The methods change. The justifications evolve. But the pattern remains. Some lives will be sacrificed. Some people will be marked and excluded, all in the name of security, stability, or the greater good. The 6-year-old Constantine, standing in that throne room with guards holding him while his uncle watches the blade approach his nose, represents something universal and timeless. The individual crushed by political necessity, the child sacrificed to adult power struggles, the person transformed into a symbol and stripped of humanity. His story, and the stories of hundreds like him across Byzantine history, deserve to be remembered not as curious historical footnotes but as cautionary tales about what happens when we allow political calculation to override human compassion, when we treat people as problems to be solved rather than as persons with inherent worth. Byzantium lasted 1,000 years. It accomplished magnificent things. Its legacy includes art, architecture, law, and learning that shaped European civilization. But it also includes the mutilated children, the ones whose noses were cut off, whose eyes were blinded, whose bodies were marked to neutralize threats they didn't couldn't understand and couldn't control. Both are part of Byzantine history. Both deserve acknowledgement. And the fact that a civilization could achieve so much while treating children so cruelly should make us question whether we're making similar compromises, achieving our own versions of magnificence while inflicting our own versions of Rhinokopia on the vulnerable. The next time you encounter historical accounts that celebrate Byzantine achievements, the preservation of classical learning, the magnificent churches, the sophisticated bureaucracy, remember also the children in the throne rooms, the ones with blades approaching their faces, the ones who screamed and bled and were told it was mercy that they weren't being killed. Remember that civilization and cruelty aren't opposites. They often walk hand in hand, with the same hands that create beauty also inflicting mutilation, with the same minds that develop law also devising justifications for systematic violence. The Byzantine Empire is gone, but the patterns it exemplified persist. And until we're willing to see those patterns clearly, to acknowledge them in our own time as well as in distant history, we'll continue to create our own versions of Rhinokopia, our own ways of marking and marginalizing, our own justifications for sacrificing individuals to the perceived needs of the powerful. The children with severed noses can't speak for themselves anymore, but their stories can still speak to us if we're willing to listen, if we're willing to see not just the historical curiosity of an exotic ancient practice but the universal pattern of how power operates and how civilizations justify cruelty. That 6-year-old prince is still standing in that throne room, guards holding him, blade approaching. He'll be standing there forever in historical memory. The question is whether we'll learn anything from his suffering or whether we'll simply admire the architecture of the throne room while ignoring the violence it witnessed.